I'm Neil Dubord, Chief of the Delta Police Department. This week on our show...
there's only one way to get a heart. Unlike a kidney, there's the living donor option. But unfortunately with a heart, there's only one way you can get one. And, your time of good fortune is, unfortunately, it is somebody else's tragedy.
Bend, don't break. This is a Delta Police podcast.
Hear more about how police officers strengthen their resiliency through the power of story.
Ray, welcome to our podcast. I'm thrilled to be able to have you here, and I think you've got a great story for us to be able to share here as well. But I want to start off, tell me a little bit about, I know you're a motorcycle. You enjoy motorcycles and you enjoy riding. So tell me a little bit about your motorcycle.
First of all, thank you, sir, for inviting me here today. I'm very, very happy to be here. With respect to my motorcycle, I'm fortunate that I was, my wife allowed me to purchase a 2017 Road Glide Ultra last year. Prior to that, I had a 2007 Street Glide, which I traded in, and my new bike I love it. It's something that I use a lot to maintain my mental health. I think keeps the stress at bay.
That's very good. Any big trips this year?
Absolutely. I did coast to coast to coast from British Columbia here. I rode all the way to New Orleans. And then from New Orleans, we thought, some friends and I, we're not that far from the Atlantic coast. So we went to Jacksonville Beach, the Atlantic coast of Florida, and then before coming back.
Good. How many days did that take you?
I was gone 24 days.
Wow. And
we did about 8,500 miles plus.
Now, did you tent with that as well?
No. I did not.
That's where the 4-star hotel comes in. That's camping.
This is where the hotels and your friendships come into place. We were lucky to stay with some friends along the way.
Oh, very cool. Now, Ray, what I wanted to be able to sort of speak to you about here today is a little bit about your story. And I know that over the last several years, you've had certainly some significant challenges. And I want to hear about those challenges, but more importantly, I want to hear about sort of how you've overcome them yourself personally and certainly as a family as well. So why don't you tell me a little bit about how that all began?
Well, without a doubt, the biggest challenge I think that's faced myself personally, as well as my wife certainly, and my kids are awfully young, and I hope this is the biggest challenge they ever face. But on the 8th of May, 2016, which was Mother's Day, my wife was returning from a lacrosse tournament that my youngest was in, and she had taken both of our children with her. They had the tournament in Kamloops, and after the tournament, she's driving home on the Coquihalla. They actually stopped in Merritt first, went to the Boston Pizza and enjoyed some endless fries. As she left with both boys in her car, they got about 20 minutes outside of Merritt on the Coquihalla Highway between Merritt and Vancouver. And she realized that she was having pain in her arm and her chest, and she was sweating. And I think in the back of her mind, she knew what it was, but she was fighting it. She thought, well, there's really no place to pull over here. As you know, the Coquihalla, the shoulders, they're pretty narrow. She thought she could push on all the way home and then go to the hospital here. But she only made it about 20, 30 minutes outside of Merritt, pulled over, and one of my children called me and said, "Dad, Mom's not feeling so well," and I could hear her in the background. She managed to pull the car over on the side of the highway, and when she heard my voice on the air, on the speakerphone, then she didn't allow herself to feel the pain or express her pain until she knew that the boys were talking to me. And I stayed on the line with them, and we got another phone in the car. And I got my youngest to call 911. And by three-way calling, I was able to stay with them. And I knew she was having a heart attack. She knew she was having a heart attack. But she really didn't tell the boys what was happening. They just knew there was something wrong with her.
So what happened? I'm gathering the ambulance arrives on roadside. How long did that take? That must have seemed like forever.
It seemed like I was on the phone with them for about 10 minutes before they got there. And, in the line of work we do, you always hear that the greatest sound you'll hear is the sirens coming when you need help. And you always picture that as yourself being in that position, needing that help. But in this case, I was over the three-way phone call. I was able to hear the sirens coming, and I was able to tell my kids, "Okay, the help is just around the corner. Just stay with your mom," and which they did.
And what happened? What went on from there?
Well, what went on is something a little unusual for somebody who's having a heart attack. Most people would stay in the car and wait for the paramedics to come to them. My wife didn't do that. She got up out of the car. She went up into the back of the ambulance and said, "My kids are coming with me. Let's get going. Let's not waste time."
So she knew the business.
She knew.
Is she a medical professional or?
Absolutely not. She's an insurance broker by trade. But her father passed away some years back, and he had the identical symptomology that she was feeling. So she knew what was going on.
Do you mind if I ask how old your wife is?
She was 43 years old at the time. And that was a couple of years ago.
And what hospital does she end up going to?
That is part of the problem, is that she didn't wind up at a hospital. She wound up at a community health center in Merritt. Obviously they're not a hospital. They're not set up for this kind of event. My wife was in a stretcher telling them I'm having a heart attack, and they said, "Well, we need to run a bunch of tests." And then I think 3 hours later, they said, "Yeah, you're having a heart attack." So there's a lot of time that was wasted.
Yes.
And then the nearest cardiac center was in Kelowna, so that was another 3 hours to get there.
By ambulance?
By ambulance.
Boy, so now we're 6 hours into the event, or probably closer to 7 hours in the event, and you're just getting to the Kelowna hospital.
Yeah.
What's happened to you at this time? So you're at home?
I had just finished a night shift, and I was actually, I was going to ride up to Kamloops and surprise my youngest and be there for one of his last tournament games. I got as far as Chilliwack before I realized I was too tired. So I turned back and I came home, and I had just parked the bike and got changed when I got the call from my kids. And once that happened, I jumped in my truck, and I wasn't feeling tired anymore.
Yeah. And you made your way out to Kelowna.
I drove up to Kelowna, yeah.
Great. So what happens certainly during that time, I can imagine you have lots of time to be able to think, and what's going through your mind?
I'm sorry, I didn't drive to Kelowna. I drove to Merritt first, because that's where she was.
Yeah.
I picked up a friend along the way, and I asked the friend to come with me, because I knew that she would need to get to another hospital. I wasn't sure where it was going to be, but I wanted my kids to come home and not have to see what was going on. So I picked up a friend, we drove to Merritt, and essentially by the time I got to Merritt, within about 20 minutes, they were telling me we're going to transfer her to Kelowna. During the drive up, I was just focused on getting there as quickly as I could. I was in my mind, I'm picturing my wife and my kids. I knew they'd be really confused. My oldest was only 13 at the time. He's 16 now, or will be next week. But a 13-year-old and an 11-year-old facing this kind of a crisis is a little outside the norm, and they handled it really well, but I had nothing to gauge it against up until this point in their lives as to how well they would respond.
So you get into Kelowna, and what do you hear? What's the synopsis?
What they told us en route from Merritt to Kelowna was it's Mother's Day. It's a day off, so they had to muster a team to come in on a day off and come and help my wife. We did a Code 3 run from Merritt to Kelowna, and I broke every traffic law possible, keeping up with them.
And I know how you like your traffic enforcement.
I kept up with them, and we rolled into the hospital at the same time. And to Kelowna, the staff at Kelowna General, to give them all the credit, they came in on their day off, and they were ready and waiting for us by the time the ambulance was backing up to their hospital. And within about 10 or 15 minutes of us arriving there, they already had her in the OR. At that point, she needed a stent, and they got that put in really, really quickly.
So when do you actually start hearing about what the news is, about sort of how much damage, about what caused this, about sort of what the future looks like?
Well, at that point, it was, okay, you've had a heart attack, we put a stent in, and you should be good to go. People rebound from heart attacks all the time, and that's what we fully expected. So this was May 8th. It wasn't until late July that we knew that there was an issue. When you leave the hospital after a heart attack, everybody gets the same, it's called a cardiac cocktail. It's a combination of medication, and it's very cookie cutter. It's essentially the same for everybody, and they put her on that cocktail. We got home, she started taking the medication as instructed, but it wasn't sitting well with her. She was feeling, it made her feel ill. We wound up calling the cardiologist that we got referred to, sort of outlining some of the symptoms she was feeling. She was very lethargic. She was very short of breath. It wasn't easy for her to keep food down. She'd get very nauseous all the time. And they said, okay, well, we'll note all this for you. I think this was in June we called, describing her symptoms. And we were told that, well, we'll jot this all down into your file, and the cardiologist will see you in October.
So now this is 5 months after the event, 6 months after the event. Yeah. Yes.
Well, unfortunately, we never got to October. What happened is that this was in June, and then by the end of July, things had gotten so bad that I wound up taking her to see her family doctor. Family doctor looked at her and said, you need to get her to emergency right away, which I did. I took her to Surrey Memorial, and she spent a couple of days in Surrey Memorial Hospital. I went home each night, and then on the third day when I went back to see her and be with her, she'd asked for some magazines to read and a couple of things from home, some slippers. When I got there, on the morning of the third day, they said, we've got an ambulance lined up. She's going to Vancouver General. And as we're walking down the hallway, I go, well, why are you transferring her? And they said, there's something really wrong with her liver, and we think she's going to need a liver transplant. And this was something I was totally unprepared for. Neither of us had any idea. We knew over the course of the last 2 days that her white cell counts were out of whack, but we had no idea about the transplant of the liver. And they rushed her down there, and that was the end of July, and it was the end of August before they figured out that she doesn't actually need a liver transplant.
Did she stay in hospital that whole time, or was she in and out? Or?
She was in hospital that whole time, from late July to, late August, when we figured out what was actually going on with her.
And what did they finally determine? What was the issue?
The issue was, is this a liver primary issue, or is this a heart primary? And you had two teams. You had a liver team and you had a heart team, and they had to put their brains together to figure out what was causing what. And in the end, they found out it was heart failure. My wife had a heart attack. People rebound from that, but she wasn't. Her heart was actually failing. And something else we learned that, as a result of this whole ordeal is we learned that she had a hole in her heart. It's called an atrial septal defect, ASD. 1 in 3 people are born with this, and for most people it actually corrects itself over time as you grow up. But for some it never does, and hers never did. We didn't know there was a hole in her heart. But with a heart failure, the heart is now not pumping sufficiently to pump the blood through the heart and through the rest of the body. And with the hole in the heart, it was actually starting to leak into the wrong side of the heart, and from the wrong side of the heart into the wrong side of the body. So what was happening here is that the liver was saying, hey, this stuff is coming back. It's not supposed to be. So the liver just shut down. My wife actually wound up with, because the liver had shut down, it wasn't eliminating fluid. So she wound up with about 25 liters worth of fluid in her body, just sitting there. Her wrists, her arms, her ankles and legs, everything just swelled up, like she was almost unrecognizable. But ultimately they did figure out it was because of the heart failure, and that was actually the first time we had learned that she's not just had a heart attack, but she's actually had a heart failure. Having learned that, they were able to start to treat it, and the liver actually corrected itself. Fortunately, they didn't start transplantation of the liver when she first got to VGH. They started treating her for heart failure because you can treat it with medication, but in her instance, it wasn't. The heart wasn't getting any stronger even with the extra help from medication, and this led to something that was actually quite devastating for us. Is we found out that my wife was very difficult to match for a transplant. So when they told us that she needs a heart transplant, that's quite a shock.
So we start on Mother's Day of this whole event. It goes right through till what time till you hear you actually need a heart transplant This
is September, October of 2016.
So fall of 2016. And you get the news now that you need a transplant. So
That's
now
right.
all of a sudden you're scrambling, and what does that mean, and how long can she survive, and all those questions are coming about your family, I can imagine. Mm-hmm. So tell me sort of what's happening in your family, what's happening with the kids. Your wife's been in hospital for 3-4 months.
Yeah. So my wife and I both decided very early on that we would be very upfront with our boys, despite their age, 11 and 13 at the time. They were right there when this all happened. In the end, to try and keep things hidden from them, we didn't think it was fair. We thought that if they knew what was going on, that it would prevent them from wondering the wrong things. I think, and I may be right, I may be wrong, but together we made that decision and we're comfortable with it. And I think our kids have handled it really well. It hasn't slowed them down at school or their other activities, and she's just very open with them.
So during this time, you're working as well, I imagine.
Yes, sir.
Or trying to work.
I did take some time off. I was very fortunate to have the time off.
Yes.
To be with her, but ultimately, I did come back to work once we had an accurate representation of what was going on, and we had some answers, and we had a plan, a treatment plan. Then it was easier to come to work.
So you know you need a heart.
We knew we need a heart.
And you know that your wife's hard to match.
Hard to match, that's right.
Okay, and so you guys are on the waiting list.
Yep, we got put on a waiting list, and there's only one way to get a heart. Unlike a kidney, there's the living donor option, but unfortunately with a heart, there's only one way you can get one, and your time of good fortune is unfortunately it is somebody else's tragedy, and that was kind of hard to wrap your head around. But at the same time, you have such young kids. My wife is young still, and she has a lot of life still left to live, and so that you kind of focus on that.
So during this time, you're waiting for a donor. And you're struggling with the whole idea of a donor, as you mentioned, because someone else's tragedy is certainly to the benefit of your wife in the opportunity for a donor heart. Is your wife at home? Or is she at home? How's that going, and how are you managing work, and how are you keeping the whole family together?
Keeping the family together, I'm very fortunate because I do have family. I've got my mom has been a stay-at-home mom her whole life. My dad has been retired for, 10, 12 years now. So we relied on them very, very heavily. Getting the kids to and from school, shuttling them to hockey practice, to games, and everything else that needs, where they need to be. Not only my dad, but we've been able to rely on close friends and other parents on teams and so forth. People have been very understanding. Have been very open to us that way. Without that help, I don't know where I'd be.
Now, this is sort of a key point for us as well. You know, part of your story is how you manage the stress and how your family manages the stress itself. So one of the things you mentioned early when we were talking is that, you know, you like to get on your bike and just sort of be alone, one with the road and one with your bike, and be able to sort of do some driving and some riding. What are some of the other things you consciously did to be able to manage that stress and to be able to manage sort of the complexity of the world you now live in?
Well, to sort of manage the whole thing would have been very difficult at any one point. I just tried to focus on the next thing, and then once you reach that, then now you focus on the next thing, and as a stepping stone. I think if you try and focus on the finish line rather than the next corner or the next street, or it becomes very daunting. If you just focus on what's immediately ahead of you and achieving that, I think by the end of the ordeal, you'll be surprised at how much you actually can tolerate or overcome.
Absolutely. Anything else you did, you know, for yourself that, you know, helped out? Tell me about how work was going. Were you receiving support at work at all?
Work has been really amazing through this process, and we're in our organization. We're very fortunate to be able to have a very generous sick time policy. And I know that's not the case everywhere, even within agencies locally here. Had I been in a situation where I had run out of my sick bank, I wouldn't have been able to negotiate this ordeal, and I don't think my family would have nearly with the ease with which we are currently doing. It has been immeasurably valuable to myself, my wife, and my kids. Just knowing that I didn't have to worry about that, it just allowed me to focus on what was important rather than what could have been.
Now, you must have been doing a good job, because I think you get promoted during that whole time too, don't you?
Yes, sir, I did.
Yeah. So you must have been doing something right.
Well, fortunately, by the time the process had started, my wife was back home. We had a game plan. By that time, she had a ventricular assist device implanted in her heart, and that bought us some time. As I said, she was very hard to match, and the doctors weren't sure that she would survive long enough for a heart to become available that was a good match for her. So what they decided to do was they decided to implant this ventricular assist device, and it basically takes over the function of the right ventricle of the heart. Very painful surgery for her, massive ordeal, scary for all of us, but we overcame it. Just through the same process I was mentioning before. Just you focus on what's immediately ahead of you, and once you achieve that, now you move on to the next thing. She got the VAD, and that bought us time, and we were able to just kind of take a big sigh and go, okay, let's heal from this, and then we can move on.
Now, you do some really cool things, and I think it sort of helps as part of your management of this issue that you don't have control of, right? Because you lose control and you're waiting for something that you have absolutely no control of, and that loss of control is actually a big piece of the stress, I can imagine. But one of the things you do is you end up doing a donor drive.
Yes, sir.
Do you want to tell me a little bit about that?
Well, after my wife had the VAD implanted, I had to look at myself, and I go, we're facing this. Where was my awareness? And being honest with myself, I had to admit that I had never thought about organ donation in my life. I hadn't thought about it. We're in a high risk occupation. We see people deceased at scenes all the time. This should have been on my forefront of my mind at some point, but it never was. And I think a lot of people are in the same boat. Until you're faced with a situation, you really don't necessarily give it the amount of thought that perhaps something deserves. So I realized that I hadn't done all I could do. So I talked to my wife, and She's a fairly private person, but I took some candid photos of her, myself, our family, and I said to my wife, I said, Vinde, I want to help other people come to this realization sooner rather than later when, hopefully they're not facing something like this, but if they do, that's the wrong time to be thinking about it because they have enough on their plate at that time. If I can get people to think about this sooner, that would be a good thing for a lot of people. So that's what we did. I approached yourself. I said, I want to do some sort of a media blitz, both internally here and into the general community. And again, I was supported by this organization, and we made that happen. I've made contacts as far away as Toronto and on the east coast of the United States where people have signed up as donors in their local jurisdictions because of that campaign.
It's amazing, absolutely amazing. I think it's tremendously successful. So I want to capture 4 things that I think that you've said that are important here before we go on and hear sort of the rest of the story and sort of wrap up our day here today. But the first thing you said is family was an important piece. That piece to be able to have a support system around you, both, whether it be the Delta Police family or whether it be your immediate family to be able to come in and assist. The second thing I heard you say is it's nice to have one kind of leisure activity that you can just get away from it all. And for you, that was riding your bike.
Yes, sir.
And just sort of getting away. The next thing I heard you say, number 3, is that you like to focus on what is immediately in front of you, to not look too far out ahead. It's incremental steps, and in my words, it's the game of inches. Every day you're going to gain an inch, and eventually when you look back, you're going to have gained a whole bunch of distance. But it's that game of inches and just keep focusing immediately what's in front of you. And certainly the final thing that I've heard you say here that I think is important for all of the people that might be listening would be around the fact that you need to be able to obtain some sort of control back. And for you, that control was being able to do something for charity, being able to recognize the importance of being a donor, and being able to drive that forward and take some piece of control back. And I think those are all 4 valuable lessons that we can learn from your story. But I want to hear sort of what happened. So how does this all play out?
Well, obviously we had the donor drive here at the Delta Police, and it really caught on far and wide through both policing contacts and through contacts through people I ride motorcycles with. Couldn't be happier with the outcome there. Just to get people thinking about it, get people messages from people all across North America saying, you know what, I'm signed up today, and it's because of what you brought this to my attention, and I signed up. I still have a lot of those messages saved on my phone. It's pretty special. My wife then spent the next 2 years on a waiting list that was eventually expanded nationwide just because of the degree of difficulty it was for matching purposes. And
let me just stop you there for a minute. But I bet you there were times where all of a sudden you would hear something, you'd get ready, you'd get a call from the hospital, and then all of a sudden it wouldn't come to fruition. Tell me about those rides, those ups and downs.
We actually had one call where the hospital called us and said, we have a heart for you. Get down here as soon as you can. And that was a year ago. It was August of 2017. I think it was September 2017 we got that call. And we raced down to the hospital. They got her checked in. They had to reverse some of the medication she was on to get her prepped for surgery. They told us, okay, surgery's going to happen by 8 o'clock the next morning. And we were excited. We couldn't believe the day had come. 7 o'clock comes, and they're saying, okay, we're getting ready downstairs in the OR. 8 o'clock comes, they haven't come to collect her. 9 o'clock comes, and we're getting worried. By 10 o'clock, they came and they explained to us. They said, okay, the donor heart is here. Everything looks great. It's a match. But the surgeon who's actually going to perform the surgery, the last check and balance in this list of checks and balances is the surgeon has to physically examine the heart. And fortunately, he found something that made him uncomfortable with proceeding. At the time, it was quite devastating for us, but the more we thought about it, we realized that it was in our best interest to implant or transplant a heart that has a defect in it. Would just put us back to square one. So apparently this is not uncommon. It happens quite frequently. We have spoken to some people we've met through the heart transplant community that they've had this happen twice. Fortunately for us, it was only once. But, it's a bit of a kick.
Absolutely.
You get your hopes up and it's not to be. Takes some thinking to wrap your head around it, but we did. And then we went on with our lives. We knew it would come one day. And sure enough, a year later, August 30th of 2018, we got another call. And there were tears. Everybody in the house. But at the same time, we tried not to let ourselves get as excited as we were the first time, because we knew there's always a chance. But fortunately, this time it was the right one.
Now, not being familiar with the transplant sort of methodology, I guess, do you know how the heart arrives? Do you know where it comes from, or do you know any history on that as a transplantee?
We keep asking, and they won't tell us. They won't tell us.
That's probably smart. Yeah.
They won't tell if it's a male or a female, whether it's how old the person is. They won't tell us if it's from in BC or outside. They will allow us to write a letter to the family, and we will send it to Transplant BC.
Wonderful.
We still haven't done it, but we plan on doing so. And then Transplant BC will make sure that the donor's family gets it, and if should they decide to correspond back, then they'll make sure we get that letter.
Wonderful. Now, so the transplant happens, and it's not an easy road to recovery. Like, this isn't something that, 2 weeks from now you're back up and you're doing your yoga.
Yeah.
So tell me a little bit about sort of what happens after the transplant.
She was going to be monitored by the team for a few hours before I was allowed to go see her, which I did. Still couldn't believe it had happened, but here we were, and you just focus on the next thing, which is at that point, she's still unconscious. She's intubated. The next step is when can we wake her up, and when can we get the tube out of her intubation tube. Going back to her VAD surgery, she experienced a tremendous amount of pain. And the amount of painkillers that the anesthesiologist was giving her wasn't working. And it took about 4 or 5 days for them to actually figure out the right combination of medication and the right level of medications before her pain was actually under control. And one of the scariest things I ever saw was, this is going back to her VAD surgery, not her heart transplant surgery. One of the scariest things I ever saw was her screaming, but not being able to vocalize her scream. I could tell by the expression on her face what she was going through. So this time around, we made sure that they were well aware of her what level of medication was going to be, where they should be looking at, what was the ballpark. Because what they started out with was an extremely cookie cutter dose. And we're not cookie cutter people. Everyone has different tolerances, different body mass, and so forth. So what they found is that she needed 6 times the dose of what was considered standard before it was under control the last time. This time we made sure that they were well aware of that early, and they weren't in a rush to actually wake her. They wanted her to ease off on the medications and let her wake that way. So in terms of pain management, that worked great. But unfortunately, when she had her transplant surgery this time, she wound up staying intubated a lot longer than perhaps she should have. And that intubation period has led to some problems in her with her vocal cords. She's actually needed 2 other surgeries since her heart transplant one of which happened about 3 weeks ago and one which is going to happen in February.
So tell me about where you sit now. What is it, the situation as it looks right now?
Situation looks good. Really good. Her heart is beating strong. She gets biopsies done every 2 to 3 weeks, where they go in and they remove a small piece of her heart tissue, and they test it for rejection. And she's always testing at 0 or 1. 1 is slight rejection, 0 is none. So she's always coming back with a 0 or a 1. A 2 is very bad, but she's never had a 2 yet. So every time she comes back with a good result from the biopsy, they actually reduce some of her anti-rejection meds. So ultimately, she'll always be on some, but it's just a question of how much she's going to need to stay at the 0.
And she's, can move, the breath is back, she's got a sort of a full functioning life now?
She does, yeah. She went to Costco with me yesterday.
Did you get a hot dog?
We didn't actually eat there this time, but I'm sure that's in our future as well.
So I'm going to ask you one more question here. What did you do? Because you're the primary caregiver, in your family. How did you keep the spirits of your children and your wife, and still at the same time manage your own emotions? How did you manage keeping that all together?
Well, I don't usually let my emotions out too much, sir.
No.
Ever. Including at home. But my wife's seen me at my worst. But probably the worst I've been, she was out cold. Mm-hmm. So the kids, we just keep them really busy. They're really focused on, they both play hockey, so they're super busy that way. We demand a lot of them from at school, and if we're going to spend a lot of time, energy, and money into hockey, then we expect them to perform at a certain level. Those are our expectations, and you know what? They thrive on that. I think the busier we keep them, the easier it has been for them to manage, because again, they just focus on what's ahead of them. And if it's, well, I've got a test on Friday, well, that's what you focus on. Or if I've got a big game this weekend, then that's what they focus on. My kids never asked, hey, you know what, Dad, when do you think Mom's going to be back to where she was? Or when do you think the transplant's going to they just focused on what's ahead.
Very cool. Now, I see we've been joined by Aaron Hill here, and Aaron's one of the drivers of these podcasts. And, Aaron has gone through his own challenges that we've heard on a previous podcast. But I want to, now that you've heard some of Ray's stories, are there any similarities to sort of what you saw and how you managed, to be able to overcome some of those challenges and barriers that you were hitting?
Can we just turn that?
Yep, absolutely. It's interesting because I've known Ray for the most part, most of my career, about 10 years. Ray and I are friends, I think. I consider him a friend. I actually
you may not think so.
I have a lot of respect for Ray, and he's actually been very good for my career. Him and I are actually quite similar in a few ways. Specifically, I've been called stoic, and I would consider Ray very stoic. He's got that very stoic personality. And I think the rides, which is very common with me, was I like to get on my bicycle, whereas you ride your motorcycle. But just kind of that downtime, the alone time, and it's kind of interesting because, like I say, that similar personality, and we both kind of benefit from that little bit of alone time and just doing our own thing, and that mental time to be on your own and think about stuff and work things out and focus on the challenges ahead, like the individual challenges. Very interesting. I like that concept of just tackling one thing at a time and getting past the one challenge and on to the next one. So very cool.
Well, sort of anything else that you want to tell us, Ray? Anything else that you want to tell us, Ray?
I really can't think of anything else to say, sir. I think my family has been through a lot over the last couple of years. I feel we've handled it relatively well, the best we can. But I don't think anyone else would be any less capable of doing or surviving what we have survived. I think for the most part, we're very, very strong people that pick this occupation, and I think we're well equipped.
Well, I've got to give it to you. You've kept your career going strong. You've got promoted during that time. Your family's together. Your kids are active and well accepting and well adapted. Your wife has a new heart, which is congratulations on that.
Thank you.
And you've left us with really 4 things today, again, that I want to repeat that I think are valuable. Family and relationships, the ability to have some sort of leisure activity for downtime, whether it's riding your cycle like Aaron or whether it's riding your motorcycle like yourself. Focusing on what's immediately in front of you, and it's that game of inches, recognizing you can't take all the ground at once, and you're going to go inch by inch and you're going to accomplish what you need to. And finally, taking whatever you can of control, like you did with your donor drive, and being able to sort of take back a little bit of control and feel that you at least can drive this a little bit. So thank you. I appreciate you sharing your story, and we certainly value all of your inputs.
Thank you all. Thank you.
So
I
much,
appreciate
Ray.
it.
Appreciate it. These productions never come without a lot of work from everyone involved. A big shout out and thank you to Constable Aaron Hill, Melissa Granum, and Nikki Hewitt for producing and recording, and of course post-production done by Podfly. Next week on Bend, Don't Break.
And I remember the call on the morning of the 3rd. I was driving to work. It was a beautiful day. And he said, you know, I've got bad news for you. The wind direction's changed from a south-southeasterly direction to a north-northeasterly direction. And the fire has jumped the river. And I knew at that time that we were in trouble.
For more episodes, you can find us on all major podcasting platforms like iTunes and Google Play. If you have a story to tell, let us know. Go to deltapolice.ca/podcast to submit your idea. And don't forget to connect with the Delta Police Department on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. Once again, thanks for tuning in.